Hello, my name is Nadine and welcome to Hop Along Studio. In today's video, I want to share with you how to use your Gelli Prints in your art journal. There are so many different ways you can make Gelli Prints, and I've shared some techniques over the last few weeks. But then the question is, what do we do with these Gelli Prints once we've made them? So today we're going to be adding them to an art journal project and show you a few different ways you can add this to your creative projects. So first of all, you can see I have three very different Gelli Prints. I have one that has a fair amount of texture but is a little bit more solid with some white spaces. This one that is very solid with very strong imagery, and this one with a lot more subtle textures. And for today's project, I think I want to use the subtle textures. I've started working in a really small art journal that I created earlier this week. I've been playing around with case-bound books, and I've been really wanting to move towards using a smaller journal. This one's about 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, and that makes for a really great small layout that will allow you to do things quite quickly instead of spending maybe hours or weeks on a project. And in this case, there is a fold in the pages, but instead of cutting these separately, because I am using copy paper on this particular Gelli Print, I'm just going to add it straight into my book and then just cut off the edges. There's several ways to adhere this. You can just use your basic collage technique, add glue to the journal, add glue to the paper, add another layer on top. For this particular layout, I don't want to add the extra adhesive on top. I like the texture of the paint and the look of the paint, so I'm just going to add glue to the back. In this case, I'm using this art glitter glue. You could use really any sort of glue that you have on hand. So this art glitter glue that works quite well on pages like this. But you could use just regular white glue. There's a lot of different options for different glues you can use. Doing books, I've actually been using a lot of wood glue recently, and that's been working quite well for my books. And there's no reason you can't use glue like that on your pages. A lot of times stuff like that is a bit of overkill. I just like using it for my case-bound books just because it does give me a little bit of extra adhesion. But really, any glue will work for this step. So you just want to add a thin layer of glue across the entire surface. What's nice about this book is because it's 4 inches, using an 8x10 Gelli plate, this gives you the right size print for the width of a page like this. I folded it in half, and I'm just going to put it down on the one side. And this is where I slip a piece of magazine paper, or in this case I have a silicone mat, so I'm slipping it underneath because I don't want to get that glue on other papers. In this case I have a scraper, but you could use a credit card or anything, and you just want to basically move it from the inside to the outside. I'm realizing I should have actually left that. You can see the lines from the glue. So on this side, I think I'm going to do that a little bit differently just so that the glue doesn't leave lines in my background, because I really want it as smooth as possible. So that little bit there didn't end up having enough glue. So now I am just pressing it down. And on this side, I'm going to add a little bit more glue. And I'm actually going to use this to smooth it out a little bit. I don't really want glue lines. I want to make sure that it's a little bit more of a smooth glue surface. And this is where maybe next time what I'll do is just use a little bit of gel medium and a brush just to make sure that I end up with a really smooth surface to work on. Just going to fold that over. You just want to make sure you have a nice good crease along that edge there if you're not going to cut them into 2 individual pages. I'm just going to move my little mat. And I'm going to clean this up first before I scrape it across. And then we're just going to scrape it across the page. And that has some adhesion at the end, but not quite enough, so I'm just going to add a little bit more glue along that edge to make sure I get a nice, strong adhesion all the way to the edge. It's always good to have a good rub with your hand. It's another way of making sure you get that down really, really well. And I would suggest letting this dry or just use a heat gun. What you want is the paper should feel not clammy or cold. When it's clammy or cold, that means the glue hasn't fully dried. So for this project, I thought I would show you how you could add distressed oxides on top of acrylic. Usually I would not say add inks on top of acrylics, but the right inks will work on top of acrylics and will dry. I usually stick with Archival ink, but I'm also going to try some distressed oxides to see how it goes. I just wanted to add in a little bit of stenciling, very lightly in places on this page. And again, it's not meant to go a lot. I just wanted to add a few more layers before I added in some other images. Again, it's very subtle. It's not meant to be really crazy dark color because there's already a lot of pattern. You don't necessarily want to add too much pattern, but it is nice to add some of these areas that just add a little bit of subtlety to the page. Before I add my next layer, just because it is Oxide ink, it's going to take a little bit longer to set, so I'm just going to set it with my heat tool. Because I do love having a lot of layers, I also want to add a little bit of text. But I'm going to be adding this with some of the colored Archival inks I have. I have this Evergreen Bough. I'm not just using just the first image, I'm also using the second and third image, just to add a little bit more texture to that page. So onto this little page, I wanted to add some of these wildflower elements as well as some of these flutter butterflies. What I love using a small art journal is that this is a great scale for this journal. And with every art journal page that I do, if you've been following me a while, you know I always have a thought that I like to share while I'm working on my page. The thought I had with this one was the idea of life doesn't have to be rainbows and butterflies to be good. It was a conversation I had with someone about the idea of being honest in our lives and being really authentic, and how sometimes that means not always being on and not always being like, oh, everything's great, everything's awesome. Like, well, maybe I'm really not doing okay, and maybe if the right people in the right situation, I can share that. Because the question I was asking myself is, what do we expect from ourselves in our lives? Or what are the expectations we feel from others that we are trying to live out? I've been thinking so much about performance and the idea of being more authentic. The question is, are we honest with ourselves, and are we selling ourselves out? When someone asks how we are, do we say, oh, I'm good, even though inside you're dying? That is something that I've really challenged myself on. Instead of always just putting a smile on, it's important to be able to be true to ourselves and honest. Instead of replying everything is awesome, just say, maybe I'm good, and maybe things are okay, but maybe I'm struggling a bit. Again, you have to always be careful about who you share that with. Preferably, it's people that know you and care about you. This page of my journal is here to remind me and challenge me to find more balance in my life, to be more honest and truthful about where I'm really at. My hope is that with this page, this can help you remind yourself not to always be on, and that you can think back to this video and to this page and just have courage to be where you're at, both the good and the bad, and you never know. Your honesty might open a conversation that you wouldn't expect with the people in your life. So often people are looking for someone else to have a little bit of authenticity with, and when you're authentic, that helps them find authenticity in their own lives. I didn't really think through the way this was going to turn out, or else I would have probably done the flowers on this side, because I do have medium and bumpy stuff in behind this page, so I did struggle with getting a good impression for both of those butterflies. So what I'm going to do is, instead of just leaving it just all black and texture colored, I'm going to add a little bit of color to the butterflies. And what I'm doing is adding in some watercolor. Watercolor will work on top of acrylic paint. It just takes a little while to dry, and you're just not going to get the same great results that you usually do when you do watercolor straight on the page, but it's going to work for what we are going to do today. Because the Archival ink is quite strong and the watercolor is quite transparent, this is a great way of just adding in a little bit of color without covering up all the black, but being able to just add in a little bit of those more yellow tones. So I just switched sides with my watercolor palette. I find it a little bit easier to work with it on my left than on my right. Just continue just to add little bits of color. It doesn't have to be perfect coloring. It's about just adding in the paint in places where you can see that there are highlights on those butterflies. And that way, like especially on this side where I did stamp unevenly for this particular butterfly, and then the one above, there are some areas I'm going to have to fill in with a pen. At least this way you can get the color in there, you can get these to stand up from the background a bit and just hide some of the little errors that I made stamping. I added in some red with my yellow just to add in some of these spots. I'm just going to add on the butterflies. Kind of stick with the warmer colors in here, so that's why I'm sticking with a little bit of orange as well. When you use watercolor on acrylic, you will notice it just pools onto the surface. It's not my favorite surface for using watercolor, but it works when you want a certain look to it. That's not how I would use watercolor. I know some people gesso before they use watercolor, and I've tried it. I personally don't like it, but to each his own. You have to figure out the technique that works for you. I've just realized that the technique that works for me is using regular watercolor paper and using watercolor in a little bit more of the traditional way. And if you find you just put a little too much color on the surface, just like I did, You can always come in and dab a little bit of it off with paper towel very carefully, because it hasn't absorbed into the paper. It's a very easy way you can lighten that color a little bit. Adding a little bit of the raw umber, the bodies. So once your project is fully dry, that's when you can go in and start affixing some of the ink where you feel like it's not quite worked or you've had a misstamping like I have here. And so for this step, I'm using the Sakura Pigma Micron pens. They're really excellent. They're super fine tipped, so they're perfect for this kind of work, but you do need to make sure this is bone dry, because these ones will not tolerate any water or any loose fibers close to the nib. You'll end up ruining your pens. And I'm not going to fix everything, but I'm going to add just a few spots that I think are going to help kind of pull this together and make this a little bit more cohesive. So for example, here where I accidentally double stamped the edges, it's going to fix a few of those edges just to help pull them together a little bit. I go up to 0.5, a few of those spots in there. I'm just going to bring them forward a little bit. And if you're not into stamping, you could completely just doodle everything that I have done here with stamps. I just use stamps because they're fast, and I have a lot of really beautiful imagery that I like using in my art journaling pages, but they're not a necessity for being able to do techniques like this. This is the one that's going to need the most work just because I ended up obliterating it. So I'm taking a look at the stamp that was used just to get a sense of where some of those lines that I'm missing should be. If you feel like there's areas where maybe you added a little too much paint, you can always go back and refine those a little bit more. By adding in only a few lines here and there with already having some color on the surface, it's a really easy way of fixing those images. And I'm just using a brush pen here just to try to fix some of these spots I feel like are a little bit light. And this is where you do have to try to be careful with colors of black ink, because this is where it can end up being a little too bold and can stick out almost worse than before. I'm trying not to go too crazy with it, but I'm trying to just fix a few places. It almost feels like too much, so I think what I'm going to do is go in and dab off a bit, and that's going to take a little bit of that oil-based color off. It's going to help it blend in a bit more with the other images. So I've added in life doesn't have to be rainbows and butterflies to be good, and just that reminder to be gentle to ourselves, to maybe change our expectations, and just let ourselves be a little bit more authentic in our lives. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and this is giving you some just different ideas on how you can use these Gelli prints in your creative projects. And if you've enjoyed this video, if you could like it, subscribe, and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on any future videos. And if you're interested in any of the supplies that I used today, I have the full supply list below, and that does include affiliate links, and that is another way you can support this channel at no additional cost to yourself. So I hope you have a really great week, that you take some time for some personal self-care, and I will see you next time.